Welcome to my Six Flags Magic Mountain tier list video where we are going to be ranking every coaster that has ever operated at Six Flags Magic Mountain, including the defunct coasters. And for me, I am someone who has had Six Flags Magic Mountain as my home park for a while now. I've been going since 2013, ever since I began being a coaster enthusiast. And I've been close to around 20-ish times now, so I'm pretty familiar with most of the coasters there at this point. So with that being said, we're going to be doing a tier list and we'll be going right into it. So our first coaster we have is a defunct coaster. This is Flashback, the Intamin Space Diver. This is a coaster that I have not ridden. And if you've seen a POV of this ride or heard from anyone who has ever ridden this coaster, it should come to no surprise that I'm going to put this in F tier. This coaster was truly one of the worst ones ever to operate, at least in the United States. It had a horrible layout, brutal transitions, and it had ridiculously slow pacing, and it was just extremely painful. If you look at the layout and look at the POV, I really don't know how this ride could have been fun at all. Even if it were smooth, it probably would have been very boring, but because it was ridiculously rough, it was just an unbearably painful ride. And it operated for a little while, actually, surprisingly, but sporadically I believe it actually operated for 11 years, which that's like 11 years longer than it should have. But let me just get it up here just to make sure. Yeah, it operated for 11 years, like I said, sporadically. Was relocated from two different Six Flags parks prior, but this coaster was truly terrible. F tier for sure. And then our next coaster is Sarajevo Bobsleds, which is actually La Vibora now at Six Flags Over Texas. So it used to operate at Magic Mountain, but it's now operating at Over Texas. It has been doing so for, I believe, over 30 years at this point. And this coaster has received mixed reviews. I have not ridden it, and I have not ridden a bobsled coaster, so it's a hard one for me to judge, but based off mixed reviews, I'm going to put it in D tier. I don't really think it looks all that great, to be honest, but there are some people that like it, and it is rare and unique since it is a bobsled coaster, but some people say this coaster is at least uncomfortable. Some people even say it's pretty rough, so I'm going to put it in D tier for that reason. And so yeah, that's pretty much that. Next, we move on to our first coaster that I have ridden. This is Colossus. And this ride, when I rode it, I only rode it once in 2014, and it's the last year of operation. And unfortunately, I also rode it backwards with the Cyclone train, so it was a complete shell of itself by the time I rode it. If we were going off of my lone experience, this would at least be in D or F tier. However, I am actually going to put it into A tier for this reason. When it opened, this coaster was supposedly one of the best in the entire world. And so that, at least according to those who had ridden it, and even for a while, it was definitely very much liked. And it is also a very historical coaster for the park. It was also the tallest wooden coaster in the world when it opened, I believe. And it was a humongous project at the time because not only was it a record-breaking wooden coaster, but it also had two sides and two tracks. So that is pretty crazy. I don't really think it actually dueled that much though, which is pretty unfortunate. And but the one other thing about it is it was a long ride, and in its earlier years, it was regarded to be very good. So for that reason, we're gonna put it in A tier. Even though some would argue in later years and also in bad conditions, like what I wrote it in, it was definitely nowhere near this. I think it's appropriate to put it there just because of how good it once was and what it means for the park and coasters in general. Next, we have Green Lantern First Flight. This is an easy F tier. I don't really need to explain this one, but I am, and I did ride it as well. And I guess I will say I only rode this once. My ride wasn't like really painful, but it was just kind of uncomfortable. We like flipped 1.5-ish times. I just remembered coming off the ride being like really confused and just not really ever wanting to ride it again, just because it really was pretty boring and uncomfortable. But for a lot of people, the ride was actually brutally painful. And its reputation is really bad. Several people have this as their least favorite coaster ever. At least I'm pretty sure that's the case. There was a Watch Mojo list even that ranked the worst theme park ride lists, the worst theme park rides, I should say. And they're not generally that well researched, but it does say something when Green Lantern makes #1 on that list, when it's a list mostly filled of like Disney and Universal rides. So that just tells you how horrible its reputation was that even they put it on there. And for that reason, and all the others I mentioned, it is an easy F tier. Next, we move on to X2, and this is an S tier all the way. One of my personal favorite coasters I have ever ridden, and one of the most intense coasters and greatest coaster creations really ever built. Has an amazing history. I mean, I don't know if amazing is the right word, but it definitely has a significant history, being the world's first fourth dimension coaster. And also being one of Arrow's greatest and unfortunately last creations, as it actually partially helped putting them into bankruptcy. But the coaster has, the coaster is, in my opinion, very phenomenal. Just an absolutely amazing ride. For me, it's a back row ride. By back row, I mean the last row to go down the first drop. And it features my favorite element of all time, which is actually that first drop. You get a pretty strong pop of airtime going down at first, and then you like face toward the ground, and then almost seemingly at the last second you flip. It's just a crazy moment, super insane and out of control, and that's what you can say for the whole ride. One of the most intense coasters I've ever ridden, and definitely the most out of control coaster I've ever done. So easy S tier, one of the best coasters in the entire world. Next, we have Apocalypse, which is one that I think this is probably going to be a major unpopular opinion, especially with the recent rise in popularity in it, at least among the coaster community. But I am going to put it into B tier. Now, B tier coasters are good. They are good rides, and Apocalypse is certainly a ride that I will try to ride anytime I'm at Magic Mountain, especially after riding it after the retrack. And it does have a really good first half. It has some really good airtime moments, I'll say really solid airtime moments in that first half. Good head choppers, and some of my favorite elements on it are the first drop, the station flyby, the entrance into it, and the drop afterwards. Those are my favorite elements on the ride, so it does have some pretty good stuff going for it, but the second half of the ride is, in my opinion, just pretty weak. And in my experience, the pacing had actually died by the end. I rode this last in, I believe it was either February or March of this year, and weather wasn't exactly the warmest. But that was my first ride since the retrack, and by the end of the ride, it had definitely slowed down, which I've heard in other conditions it's like hauling toward the end, so maybe I just need to give this a ride in better conditions. But in my experience, I think this coaster is a very solid wooden coaster, but I don't think it's one of the best wooden coasters in California or anything like that. Like some people I had heard from who had said that, but it definitely is a very, very solid ride, a very good ride. Next, we have Mountain Express, which was a Schwarzkopf Wildcat, one of the least talked about Magic Mountain defunct coasters. I'm putting this into C tier. I haven't done one of these coasters, and I never got to do Mountain Express, but these rides do look very solid, like very fun rides. They look like they have some decent laterals at certain points and some good airtime and some good drops. So pretty simple but solid looking rides. I'm going to put it into C tier. Next, we have Shockwave, which is an Intamin stand-up, very reminiscent of the earlier B&M stand-ups, except this actually predated those, if I'm correct. And this picture is of the one of it actually when it was operating at Astro World, because that's where it mostly operated. I'm putting this into D tier. I never rode this coaster, and from what I heard, it wasn't very enjoyable, but Magic Mountain's F tier is so bad that I'm not gonna put it there. Basically, the layout, in my opinion, looked pretty basic and bland. It only had one inversion. The ride was said to be pretty rough at certain points, and like it was comparable to earlier B&M stand-ups, which aren't really my favorite kind of rides. So I think D tier is appropriate. Next, we have Cyclone, which is the defunct wooden coaster of the park, outside of Colossus, of course. And this ride was manufactured by Din Corporation. It first opened in 1991, and I'm just gonna put this thing in F tier. Now, this coaster, I did look into online reviews of it, and supposedly, according to a few people, the ride was actually somewhat decent before the Northridge earthquake happened, which happened in the mid-90s, and apparently after that it just was never the same. And in its last years of operations, it was said to be just ridiculously rough, brutal, and just absolutely just terrible. It is the only wooden coaster to ever have B&M wooden coaster trains, so that is obviously not a good thing. They actually put those on Colossus also when they made it run backwards. That was my only experience on it, and so that's why I did not like it. These trains were terrible, and they seemed to really help the ride deteriorate quicker. And the pacing of this ride just looked absolutely atrocious. It was just so slow, especially in its final years. And at that point, it also looked pretty boring. So just all around looked like a pretty bad ride. And there were only a few positive reactions and or reviews I even saw of it, and they even had to point out it was like before an earthquake. So for most of its time, it was basically a really bad ride. So F tier all the way. Next, we have Scream, which is the park's B&M floorless coaster. I'm gonna put this in C tier. This coaster gets trashed on a lot. I've definitely been part of that sort of train. However, I will say that this ride is actually pretty solid. It's a solid coaster. It's decent. It's just at a park with Riddler's Revenge, it definitely feels out of place just because it's quite a bit inferior and it's a very similar coaster. And I found the layout to be pretty uninspiring, and also the parking lot setting doesn't really help. And I have found it to be rattly at certain points, but it is a solid looping coaster. It's got some decently intense moments and some solid inversions. It's just with other looping coasters at the park that I think are just better. It's not one that I really ride that often when I'm at Magic Mountain. The next coaster we have is Batman the Ride, and I'm gonna put this in B tier. This is by far the coaster I need to re-ride the most. I have not ridden it in years because it's been closed for various reasons, my last few visits, and I've never really gotten the best feel for this ride. But the one thing I will say about it is that I do appreciate that it is like uber intense. It is one of the few coasters that can consistently make me gray out. It does it every time I ride it, so that is something I respect. It's super whippy. It has some insane pacing. But like I said, I just haven't gotten the best feel for it. I rode it backwards once. I didn't really enjoy that, but that was when I was a lot younger. And I think my taste in coasters have changed quite a bit since the last time I rode this, so I think this could actually go even higher. I really do like these like really intense B&M inverts, so I do think that if I ride it again, it might even go into A tier. We'll see. But for now, I'm going to put it into B tier. It's still a very solid and good ride for sure. Next, I have Canyon Blaster, which for kiddie coasters, I'm actually going to handle this a bit differently. There are 4 kiddie coasters at Magic Mountain, so good kiddie coasters, I'm going to put in S. Average to kind of just like average or just kind of okay kiddie coasters, I'm going to put in C. And then bad ones, I'm going to put in F. And Canyon Blaster is definitely a good one. It's my favorite one of the bunch, so I'm putting it in S. like I said, it's relative to kiddie coasters. I don't think Canyon Blaster is better than Apocalypse, so don't freak out about that. But this is a kiddie coaster that I rode, I think, only on a few visits when I was young I rode it with my younger brother. And this coaster, it's kind of janky, but in a good way. It has some nice airtime pops. It's just, it actually does something, and it's a kiddie coaster. I just like it. It's got a good experience to it, and I do like these E&F Miler kiddie coasters compared to other models, so that's why it's going to be S tier for a kiddie coaster. Next we have Full Throttle. This is an A tier. This coaster is very much a very fun ride. I will also say for this coaster, I much prefer the front row on it just to experience the launches this ride has to offer. And my favorite element on the ride is the vertical loop. The hang time you get on it is just so insane. One of the best inversions I've ever experienced. The only downside here is that the ride is short. It's very short. But other than that, this ride is just a ton of fun. Definitely one of the better coasters at Magic Mountain, and one that I always look forward to riding when I go. So A tier for Full Throttle. Next we have Gold Rusher they're all at Magic Mountain, but this was actually the opening day coaster for Magic Mountain, and I'm gonna put it in C tier. Now, C tier does not mean bad. These are actually like rides that I will ride if convenient enough. If I'm feeling like riding it that day and the wait is pretty short, sure, I'll check these rides out. So that definitely applies for Gold Rusher. It's got some really good terrain usage, some nice scenery. It's got some good speed for a mine train. It even has some airtime on it. Not much, but it has a little bit. And it very much feels like a classic coaster. So it's a very, very solid sort of family coaster for the park. And it's one of my favorite mine trains I've experienced. And like I said, opening day attraction. So obviously that's kind of a big deal just historically. So yeah, C tier feels appropriate for this ride. Next we have Goliath, and this is a coaster that has definitely changed quite a bit for me over the years, but at this point I am actually going to put it in the B tier. My last visit, I actually rode it in the front row for the first time in a while, and I definitely think that's the way to go with Goliath. The coaster is, let's face it, pretty dumb for a hyper coaster. I mean, it has the stats and everything, but the layout definitely leaves a lot to be desired, especially the first half. But the one thing the ride does do well is it has a really good sensation of speed throughout the entire, I would say throughout most of the ride. And the second half is also really intense, so you gotta respect that, of course. So those are some good things about it. And I think if you go in with the expectations of like, this is just kind of like, this isn't going to be that amazing of a ride, I guess, which I guess that doesn't sound that great. If you lower your expectations for Goliath, I think it's very much a ride you can enjoy. Like I said, especially in the front row, there's some good sensation of speed to be had, and like I said, the ride's really intense. The big thing for me that kind of hurts this ride, outside of the layout really being really uninspiring, is the mid-course. It just kills like all the momentum because you come to a complete stop. So that's kind of unfortunate, but I still think Goliath is pretty fun, and I've learned to enjoy it, which is nice. Even if it's a hyper coaster that is one of my least favorite of the bunch, it's still a ride that I can enjoy, which is the important thing. Next we have Magic Flyer. I have never ridden this because the maximum height requirement is 54 inches, but I will put it in the C tier. This is a coaster that opened in the opening year of the park, and it may have even actually operated somewhere else. That's disputed, but this may actually be the oldest operating coaster at Magic Mountain. So that is kind of interesting, but I've just never ridden it, so I'm just gonna put it in C. This seems solid for like the little kids, but I'm not gonna say a whole lot more than that. Next we have Ninja, and I'm gonna put this ride in B tier. I was really impressed with my last ride on it during my last visit. Rode it in the back row. Terrain usage obviously is very good, has some nice scenery, but along with that terrain usage, the ride is also deceptively fast at points, and it has some nice swinging action, so it's definitely it's a very exciting, family-oriented coaster. I would say definitely it definitely is a very good one. It's just a coaster that I very much have enjoyed. I enjoyed my last visit, and as I said, it's pretty exciting for a coaster that's more meant for families. So B tier, and it's also a rare model, being an aero suspended, so it very much also has that kind of unique charm to it as well. So B tier for Ninja. Next we have Speedy Gonzales Hot Rod Racers. This is an F tier. I rode this once with my little brother. I don't even think he liked it. I've heard from other people that they didn't like this coaster. I've actually kind of avoided this kiddie coaster model at other parks just because of this coaster. It's just kind of like weirdly bumpy, and the layout, it's so boring. It's like the most boring. I can't say it's the most boring kiddie coaster layout, but it's definitely up there. So I'm gonna put it in F. It's probably fine for kids, but I mean, I really don't even think it's worth going out of your way for, unless you really care about the credits like that badly. Next I have Superman Escape from Krypton, and this one, there already have been a few controversial rankings. I'm sure this will be another one. I'm going to put this coaster into C tier. Now, obviously, this is a coaster that has a lot of historical significance for Intamin, for coasters in general, and for Magic Mountain. This was one of the first coasters to break the 100 mile per hour speed barrier, I suppose. Intamin, they ended up building many launch coasters after this that are really good, so this was definitely a great stepping stone toward that. And I mean, it's just like a huge ride, so that is something to be, there's something to be said about that. But as for the actual ride experience, the launch is definitely good, but for being 100 miles per hour, it's actually a pretty gradual launch, so it's not anything that incredible. But like I said, the launch is still solid, and the weightlessness you get on the spike is also really good. Like when you're going, like kind of like almost stalling out at the top, the weightlessness you get is pretty awesome. So I will say that about Superman. But the ride is very short, and it seems like every time I ride it, I get like more and more disappointed, just because I'm expecting to get something new out of it, and I don't. I have unfortunately not ridden it forwards. Usually, I've only experienced it going backwards, so from the launch point. And so maybe it going forwards would change my mind. I was hoping to do that my last visit, but the forward side was of course closed. Maybe that'll change my opinion a little bit, but I'm not gonna say it will because I really don't know if it will. So I'm gonna put Superman into C tier for now. Next we have Tatsu, and I'm going back and forth between S and A tier for this, but I do think I am gonna have to put this in A tier. This is one of my favorite coasters at the park. The pretzel loop for this ride is absolutely phenomenal. One of the most intense moments on any coaster on the entire planet. You really feel like you're getting magnetized to the track at that point. It is just insane. And it also provides a really good flying sensation kind of experience, which is, for me, pretty unique because I haven't ridden any other flying coasters, so I do really appreciate that. It also has, and it also utilizes its terrain really well, which is pretty cool for a flying coaster. Like, some of the views you get are also pretty insane as well. So A tier for Tatsu, one of my favorite rides at the park. And then the next coaster is Wonder Woman Golden Lasso, not Golden Lasso, Wonder Woman Flight of Courage. I'm sure a lot of us have mistaken Golden Lasso and Flight of Courage at this point. I'm going to put this in the A tier for now. Obviously, I've not ridden it. I have not ridden Jersey Devil either, which is a near clone. It has not opened as of the time of this recording, but I am planning on riding it in the future here. And after I do, I probably will make like an official Magic Mountain countdown video with updated thoughts on these rides. But the ride's going to have a lot of airtime. Dive loop looks really good, and the 0G stall also looks just awesome. We'll have to see how the pacing of the ride is, and the other thing is I have ridden the smaller RMC Raptors, and I don't like the restraints, so that is going to be one knock on Wonder Woman, but I am intrigued to ride this coaster. It could be S, it might be A, it probably will be an A tier for me once I ride it, but who knows. Maybe it'll be B tier if I'm like disappointed. We'll see what happens, but should be a nice addition for Magic Mountain, and I can't wait to ride it. Next we have Riddler's Revenge, and this is another A tier coaster for me. So I mentioned that Scream is like an inferior version, or just kind of inferior to Riddler's Revenge, and that is because Riddler's Revenge has a really good layout. It has a lot of great inversions. You have the vertical loop, which is really awesome, that also goes through the lift hill, or wraps around the lift hill, I should say. You also have the 2 dive loops that I really enjoy, and the inclined loop it's a very weird element, especially on like a stand-up coaster. You don't really see it too often, so one of my favorite like elements on the ride. So it's got some nice elements there, and this is also a coaster where I think the stand-up trains actually benefit the ride. I'm not bothered by the stand-up trains. I don't think this coaster runs rough. I think it actually runs pretty smooth. So I definitely am a fan of the stand-up trains on this ride. And the coaster, if I haven't already said, I probably have, but it is very, very intense. So definitely one of my favorite coasters at the park, and A tier for that reason. Next we have Deja Vu, which is the Vekoma inverted boomerang. And that is defunct, by the way. I was not able to ride this, unfortunately. I believe it closed just 2 years before I visited. And it has some mixed reactions, even when it operated at Magic Mountain. I know in more recent years, more people have kind of had like a positive outlook on this coaster, if you would like to say that. But I don't. It's one that I've also seen quite a bit of negativity around. Obviously, it also operated horribly at Six Flags New England when it operated at Goliath, but that was partially because it got new trains that were just horrible. I am not the biggest fan of normal boomerangs. I've never done an inverted boomerang, but some people really didn't like this ride and said it was really rough. Other people thought this ride was great. I'm going to put this into D tier. Just mixed reactions. And some of these coasters of these models being not very good, I think that warrants it being in D tier. I know some people are going to be unhappy about that, but that's just where I put it. And then next we have Roadrunner Express. This is a Vekoma Junior coaster. Actually, I'll just put the kiddie coasters at the back of each tier. I'm not, the order of these, don't ignore it. I'm not really focused on that, but the kiddie coasters I'll just put in the back of each tier. But Roadrunner Express, this is a C tier for me in terms of kiddie coasters. It's pretty average. It's just a Vekoma Junior coaster. If you've ridden one, like, you kind of know what the rest are like. So, I know some have different layouts, but I mean, there's not a whole lot of variety there unless they have like really good theming. This one has a little bit of theming, but nothing too crazy. But the one cool thing about this ride and why it might be worth your time trying to ride is it does have a bit of a cool history, since it was actually relocated from Six Flags New Orleans after the Hurricane Katrina happened. And it was one of only 2 coasters from the park to get relocated, so it did actually survive the event. So that is something pretty interesting about it, just kind of a bit of interesting history. The other coaster that survived is Goliath at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. But other than that, it's pretty generic, so C tier definitely feels like the right sort of one. Alright, next we have Viper, and this is of course the classic Aero Mega Looper. And this coaster has really grown on me in recent years. I'm going to put this in B tier. I think it has, that it's pretty intense, has some nice inversions, along with some decent speed at points. It's just a classic ride. You can't really, I mean, I say you can't go wrong with it. Actually, a lot of people don't like this ride, but in more recent years, I think that Magic Mountain has actually put some pretty good care into keeping this ride around and keeping it, I guess, maintained well. And it's just a classic. So I enjoy it, and I have avoided headbanging on it, which has been a big thing for me in terms of enjoying it. But there are some transitions that can be a bit janky to even a bit painful, so be warned for that if you haven't ridden it. But I still think the ride is very enjoyable, and it's definitely a coaster that I try to ride when I'm at Magic Mountain at this point, which is not something I used to say. Next we have is New Revolution, and this is very much a C tier. It also has some unique history, or some cool history to it, having been the first modern coaster with a vertical loop, and so that makes it obviously a pretty big landmark. But as for the coaster itself, it's solid, it's pretty fun, it has some nice scenery, terrain usage, and it also feels like a classic coaster. And obviously it has, like I said, that vertical loop. It's just a very nice stepping stone coaster for those trying to get into the more extreme stuff. This is like a perfect first inversion type of coaster for anyone who hasn't ridden a coaster with inversions. This is like pretty much perfect. It's not really that intense. It's a pretty fun ride, but of course it has the loop in there. So I think for that purpose, it's pretty good, and it's a solid ride to just do every once in a while. But at this point, I don't really think it's like one of the best coasters at the park or anything like that. Next, we have Twisted Colossus. This is an easy S tier. I think this is like one of the best coasters. I mean, obviously it's one of the best coasters at the park. It's one of my favorite I've ever done up to this point. And it is a coaster that I also consider a back row ride. It is also a very long ride, which Magic Mountain doesn't exactly have a ton of those, so that's definitely something that's appreciated. And it has some amazing airtime moments and just great elements. Some of my favorite elements are the first drops on both sides, the blue side big drop, the blue side airtime hill under the Top Gun stall, and of course the green side Top Gun stall, which has some amazing hang time and is one of the best inversions I've experienced. So it's got a lot of really good elements. When it's dueling, the coaster is just even more enjoyable. It's hardly happened for me in recent visits, but if you're able to get that dueling ride, that just makes it even better. But even without the dueling aspect, it's still a phenomenal coaster and one of the best out there. So easy S tier, really good ride. And then the last coaster I have is West Coast Racers, which I just experienced for the first time in my last visit. Got to do it 3 times. This is an A tier. It is definitely one of the coasters that I'm going to be excited to ride whenever I go to the park, when I look forward to. It's a very good and enjoyable coaster. And for me, it is a front row ride. Those premier trains, I just don't like them that much, so I don't like having seats in front of me to kind of crunch on my legs. They're pretty cramped, even though I'm not like super tall or anything. And I just feel like the ride's more enjoyable in the front for West Coast Racers, so I will say it's a front row ride for me. My favorite element on it is the high five on the white side, or the white track. It's just a crazy moment. You get insane airtime and laterals at the same time. It's an amazing element. Honestly, one of the best ones at the park, period. So really, really good element. And then the dueling aspect, it duels pretty much every time. So that aspect is really good, adds a lot to the experience, and it also is a long ride once you combine the two sides. The only things I have against it are the comfort collars. I actually didn't mind them in the front row, but in the back row, I got my neck was like banging on the collars a little bit, so that wasn't exactly fun. And then the pit stop, I'm like probably the only person who had this experience. This is probably a fluke. I'm gonna have to write it again to see if this is like legit, because I've never heard this be criticized. But when I did the pit stop during my experience, I wasn't sure if I was going to enjoy it or not, if it was going to have good theming, but it really doesn't. And the pit stop is when you're in the middle of the ride and the other train has to be loaded. Basically, you get in there, a bunch of loud noises play, and the loud noises are kind of like blaring and at some points almost deafening. I'd compare it to being next to a car at a stoplight where the car next to you is playing really loud music. You can't actually hear the music, but it's so loud that you just feel and hear the vibrations, if that makes sense. That's what I would compare it to, which might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's honestly how I felt about it. And then there's also air conditioning in there, but on my visit it actually was blowing in hot air, so that obviously wasn't ideal. I hope it's not like that during more warm weather months, because that would be pretty miserable. But yeah, that was obviously not great. But the ride itself, when you're actually riding it, is pretty great. So West Coast Racers, definitely A tier. And so with that being said, that is our tier list. Definitely make sure to let me know in the comments down below what you think of my rankings, how maybe you would rank some of the coasters, because I know that we're gonna have a bunch of different opinions, and that's totally cool. That's one of my favorite parts of seeing the comments, is like seeing what other people think of the coasters at Magic Mountain. So definitely let me know in the comments which coasters are some of your favorites, which ones are some of your least favorites, and especially if you've ridden some of the defunct coasters, let me know your thoughts on those, because that's probably where my tier list is probably the most iffy, especially the ones I haven't ridden. So I would really appreciate that. And also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I would really appreciate it. Also, liking the video would be awesome. It helps both the video do better and my channel grow, so I would really appreciate that. And so yeah, that's pretty much it. So with all of that said, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time here on Coaster Hour.